I apologize, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation or anything high-tech. In fact, I almost didn't, I'm really sorry. I almost didn't have anything at all. This thing is still almost too hot to touch. But I'm going to read it. I'll try to read it with feeling and so on and so forth, because I'd much rather just talk, but I've got too much stuff crammed into this to do that, so I'll just try to read it and do it with some sense of life. I was asked for a title for this thing, and I hadn't really thought of one. So I thought of one in the back here. They call it something like the Protean Joseph Smith. Maybe some of you know the legend of Proteus, Greek demigod or god, minor god, change shape at will. You'll see why I think of that title. In their editor's introduction to the recently published anthology entitled American Apocrypha, Dan Vogel and Brent Metcalf declare, had the Book of Mormon been what Joseph Smith said, not an allegory with spiritual import, but a literal history of Hebrew immigrants to America, this should have been verified by now. It's a strange statement. For example, one wonders when exactly the deadline for verification passed. Was it in 2000, 1990, 1950, 1880? How was the date chosen? Who said it? And what would verification consist? Okay. Perhaps more significantly, though, one wonders why the statement could not just as easily be turned on its head. Were the Book of Mormon false, this should have been verified by now. One could, with at least equal justification, announce that had the Book of Mormon been a fraud, its critics should by now have been able to agree on an explanation as to how, why, and by whom it was created. That they have not seems to me powerful evidence that it is not in fact fraudulent, and that its dedicated enemies, who have devoted immense amounts of energy to their enterprise for the better part now of 2 centuries, have signally failed. The fact is, the falsehood of the book has no more been demonstrated to the satisfaction of all serious observers than has its truth. But what is even more striking is that critics of the Book of Mormon have not yet been able even to formulate a coherent counter-explanation, a unified global theory, with which to challenge the traditional story of the book's origins. John A. Widtsoe remarked in his 1951 preface to the 2nd volume of Francis Kirkman's New Witness for Christ in America, unbelievers in Joseph Smith's story have not been able to agree on any one explanation. It has even been necessary by some writers to change the explanation they first proposed. This unsuccessful changing search is of itself an evidence of the truth of the prophet's own story. At first, Joseph Smith was regarded as wholly responsible for the production of the Book of Mormon. This was the explanation that completely dominated skeptical discourse until roughly 4 years after the publication of the book. But it arose before the book even appeared. Since Joseph was a superstitious and ignorant peasant, the Book of Mormon would naturally be beneath serious notice. He was an ignoramus, said the gem of Rochester for 15 May 1830. That spindle-shanked ignoramus Joe Smith, echoed the Palmyra Reflector for 30 June 1830. An ignoramus who could neither read nor write, explained Obadiah Dogberry in the same newspaper in July of 1830. As the Palmyra Freeman noted in 1829, the subject was almost invariably treated as it should have been, with contempt. This most clumsy of all impositions, Dogberry characterized the Book of Mormon in January 1831. In February, Dogberry offered a more extended estimation of Joseph Smith and his family. The prophet had but little expression of countenance other than that of dullness. His mental powers appeared to be extremely limited, and from the small opportunity he had in school, he made little or no proficiency. We have never been able to learn that any of the family were ever noted for much else than ignorance and stupidity. The Reverend Thomas Campbell, in a February 1831 letter to his former colleague Sidney Rigdon, dismissed the Book of Mormon as, quote, a production beneath contempt and utterly unworthy the reception of a schoolboy. During the same month, Thomas Campbell's illustrious preacher's son, Alexander, told the readers of his famous Jeremiah against the Book of Mormon entitled Delusions, that Joseph Smith was, quote, as ignorant and as impudent a knave as ever wrote a book, an ignorant and impudent liar. The book, he said, professes to be written at intervals by different persons during a long period of 1,020 years. And yet, for uniformity of style, there never was a book more evidently written by one set of fingers, nor more certainly conceived in one cranium since the first book appeared in human language than this same book. If I could swear to any man's voice, face, or person, assuming different names, I could swear that this book was written by one man. And as Joseph Smith is a very ignorant man and is called the author on the title page, I cannot doubt for a single moment that he is the sole author and proprietor of it. The Book of Mormon, Campbell said, is without exaggeration the meanest book in the English language. As ignorant as too many of the people are, said a March 1831 letter to the Palmyra Reflector, it's hardly possible that so clumsy an imposition can spread to any considerable extent. Also in March of 1831, David Burnett, editor of the Evangelical Inquirer, described Joseph Smith as, quote, a perfect ignoramus, unquote. Though Burnett was unable to be more precise about the length of the Book of Mormon than to say that it was between 500 and 1,000 pages. Since he confessed, when I saw it, I did not notice the number. The fact was, however, that the perfect ignoramus Joe Smith had actually produced a substantial and complex book. Moreover, he and his book were acquiring a solid and numerous following. How could this be accounted for? How could someone whose mental powers were extremely limited have produced a lengthy book and founded a growing new religious faith? Of course, the Book of Mormon was still beneath contempt. Daniel Kidder's 1842 expose found it, quote, nothing but a medley of incoherent absurdities. Quote, a bundle of gibberish, wrote J.B. Turner in 1842. Those, therefore, who were convinced by it must necessarily themselves be beneath contempt. Speculating in the utter absence of any evidence that Sidney Rigdon and Parley Pratt had converted to Mormonism on the basis of, quote, a jerk or a twitch or a swoon, unquote, Turner proceeds to comment that it is indeed difficult to see how any man, especially of a nervous temperament, could read Smith's book through without being thrown into some sort of hysterics. The marvel is that it should ever have happened otherwise. It is unquestionably one of the most unreasonably disgusting works in the English or any other language, declared 1944 reputation. It is less interesting than anything we've ever seen. Filled with such idle vagaries as would disgrace a common scribbler, the most contemptible piece of presumption that has ever come under our own observation, and is an admixture of blackguardism and nonsense we will poison against the world. It won't bear any examination in any point, yet we will proceed in detail. Time and again, authors of lengthy exposés and refutations feel they need to apologize for wasting their own and their readers' time on so palpably ludicrous a subject. Alexander Campbell at first, quote, thought it best not to take public notice of it, as the system was so unreasonable and ridiculous that no person of good common sense would believe it. But having witnessed the progress of the delusion among some of our respectable citizens, some of whom were considered worthy members of society, I have felt it my indispensable duty to use my exertion against its spreading and contaminating influence. I would ask forgiveness from all my readers for even noticing the Book of Mormon, Campbell continues, had not several hundred persons of different denominations believed in it. To make an earnest attack on Mormonism, as if it had any plausible pretensions to credibility, wrote Origen Baxter in the opening of his earnest 1838 attack on Mormonism, entitled Mormonism Exposed, would argue great want of discernment and good sense on the part of one who might thus assail it. It would be somewhat like a labored attempt to disprove the theory of Tom Thumbs, or like the attack of Don Quixote on the windmill. The Book of Mormon was, he said, the most gross, the most ridiculous, the most imbecile, the most contemptible concern that was ever admitted to be pawned off upon society as a revelation. It has no merit even as a forgery. Its author was a blockhead. Still, even if Joseph Smith was nothing but a blockhead, the Book of Mormon existed, and it grounded a movement that was attracting troubling numbers of converts. Clearly, Joseph must have had help. On this, believing Latter-day Saints and their critics could agree. The gross ignorance of this man, wrote James Hunt in 1844 expose of Mormonism, was looked upon by his early followers as his greatest merit, and as furnishing the most incontestable proofs of his divine mission. And gradually the skeptics realized that their own first explanation had to be jettisoned as simply implausible. But believers and critics parted company on the identity of the helper or helpers. While most critics suddenly became willing to imagine a conspiracy of considerable size that may or may not have included Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer and Parley Pratt, Sidney Rigdon, an experienced clergyman and Bible student, a Campbellite preacher before his conversion to Mormonism, was the favored candidate for the role of chief facilitator of what they devoutly believed to be a fraud. The hypothesis received its debut in the granddaddy of all anti-Mormon books, Edward E. Howe's 1834 cult classic, Mormonism Unveiled. But Rigdon was not the absolute author of the Book of Mormon, according to this explanation. He was merely, quote, the Iago, the prime mover of the whole conspiracy, the transmitter to Joseph Smith of a manuscript originally authored by one Solomon Spaulding, a Dartmouth College-educated former clergyman who had expressly declared his disbelief in the Bible before his death in 1816. Howe described the Book of Mormon as, quote, unquestionably one of the meanest in the English or any other language. It is more devoid of interest than any we have ever seen. It must have been written by an atheist to make an experiment on the human understanding and credulity. The author, although evidently a man of learning, studied barrenness of style. Studied barrenness of style expression without an equal. The real author, notwithstanding his studied ignorance, was well acquainted with the classics. The sameness is such in the tautology of phrases from the beginning to the end of the work that no one can be left in doubt in identifying the whole with one individual author. But that author, of course, was no longer that spindle-shanked ignoramus Joe Smith. Now it was the classically educated Solomon Spaulding. Howe thought he might even be able to discern in the Book of Mormon the hand of a fearless infidel who had attempted a ridicule upon the Holy Bible, perhaps in a bid to bring down contempt upon the inspired writers in the religion of Jesus Christ. Howe seems to have been aware, however, that he did not have in his possession the evidence that would establish his case beyond reasonable doubt. So he hedged his bets. That there has been from the beginning of the imposture a more talented knave behind the curtain is evident to our mind at least, but whether he will ever be clearly, fully, and positively unveiled and brought into open daylight may of course be doubted. His modesty was compelled by the striking lack of evidence that today has led most critics ultimately to drop the Spaulding manuscript theory of Book of Mormon origins. None of this stopped some critics from actually manufacturing ersatz evidence. In his 1855 book, The Prophets, or Mormonism Unveiled, O.S. Belial is able to furnish his readers with a transcript of the conversation in which the Book of Mormon plot was hatched. Permit me to read from this invaluable document. A conversation between Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon, in which they decided upon a plan to print the Book of Mormon. Easily obviated, returned Smith coolly, using the kind of vocabulary, no doubt, that led people to call him an illiterate ignoramus. You know I have the seer stones, and I can make them believe I divined it by them, or what is better still, say a Urim and Thummim, of which Spaulding speaks, was discovered with it. Rigdon, nothing could be better. If we could evade discovery. Spaulding, Peterson, and I have read it to numbers of different people, and I'm almost sure they would detect us. Smith, you tell me Spaulding and Peterson are both dead, as well as several others who saw it in their possession. Rigdon, yes, but Spaulding's wife still lives, and she knew its contents perfectly well. She could not be deceived. Smith, perhaps she might, returned the prophet musingly. I tell you, Rigdon, the more I think of it, the more possible it appears. We must be cautious but vigorous, and I am sure we shall at least create an excitement that will fill our pockets at last, and raise us above those who have scorned us all our lives. Rigdon, here is the manuscript, but use it carefully, and as you value the success of our schemes, let no one see it or know it was ever in your or my possession, and be wary, and not have a vision too often, or you will, by your overzeal, draw down contempt from even the most ignorant. Long these two worthies communed over this scheme for deception, and when the hours had waned and they had set on a firm basis a train of duplicity that should startle the world, even then, from the depth of their corrupted hearts, gloated over the consternation one day's work had done of their impious fraud. Their only object at that time was to play upon the credulous, earn applause from the debased, and extort money from the simple under the plea of a divine mission, and thus deceive and rob in a mode of which no law could arraign them for the offense. Pride, ambition, and an overweening thirst for power led Smith to concoct the scheme, while the most consummate hypocrisy, which he played off on several denominations of Christians with the hope of rising with the tide, was Rigdon's motive. Honor, integrity, and all the nobler passions of the human heart had been stilled in the breasts of both, and now not remained to stem the newborn crime, which should drag their own names to the depths of infamy and enslave in vice thousands of their fellows. Now clearly we've come some distance from Joseph Smith, whose only expression was one of dullness, whose mental capacities were extremely limited, whose family was known only for their general stupidity. Now he's a consummate schemer, a fiendishly clever deviser of hellish plots. The Hurlbut Howe Spaulding theory dominated skeptical explanations of the Book of Mormon for 50 years, from the publication of Mormonism Unveiled in 1834 until 1884. Even the Reverend Alexander Campbell, he who had proclaimed the obvious fact that the book had been composed in one ignorant cranium, soon proclaimed the obvious fact that Spaulding of Dartmouth was the author. The theory was not always consistently held, of course. J.B. Turner, for example, wrote that the Book of Mormon was characterized by, quote, uniformity of style in the highest degree. It is all Joe Smith, from preface to fini, testimonials and all. Joe Smith is sole author and proprietor, as he himself claimed on the title page of the first edition. Within just a few paragraphs, however, Turner remarks that although any blunderhead with the Bible at his side might have written the book, and the greater the blunderhead the better, still there are some reasons to believe that Smith is not the original author, even though the gibberish that constitutes the plot of the comedy. And that U-turn was too blatant even for Turner's fellow anti-Mormon Daniel Kidder, It appears to us, Kidder wrote, that Professor T has involved himself in a species of self-contradiction. By maintaining that Joe Smith is the real and sole author of the Book of Mormon, while at the same time he proves the identity of that book with the Spalding manuscript. Moreover, he commented, in direct contradiction to both Turner and the Reverend Alexander Campbell, we are far from assenting to the position that unity, either of style or sentiment, prevailed throughout the Mormon Bible. Those who had seen Spalding's manuscript say the religious parts of the Book of Mormon had been added. Now, this reminds me of a story that a friend of mine told me years ago. She had a long discussion at a Christmas party with Richard Feynman. Some of you will remember the name of the very famous Nobel laureate physics professor at Caltech. In the course of it, they were talking about C.S. Lewis, and suddenly Feynman exclaimed that he just loved C.S. Lewis's fiction, except for all that vile religious propaganda. Now, my friend, who was a freshman at the time, took some nerve to go against the Nobel laureate, tried to point out gently that the religious propaganda wasn't just grafted on to Lewis's novels. It was integral to the story. But that's too much for Feynman to get, I guess. Anyway, the idea here is that the Book of Mormon, it was originally a secular book with a little bit of religious stuff thrown in here and there. You can see that, can't you? Now it says these religious parts, this is Kidder writing, these religious parts bear a distinctive character, that of Campbellism, which Smith was utterly unqualified to give them until after his connection with Rigdon. This shows that there were at least 3 parties to the real authorship, and we think it would be sheer injustice not to put Oliver Cowdery, the schoolmaster, upon as good literary footing as his more ambitious pupil, Joseph Smith, Jr. That no copy of Spalding's manuscript was available for inspection did no more to dampen enthusiasm for the theory than did such inconsistencies. After all, there seemed no alternative that was both realistic and palatable. The manuscript, devotees of the theory said, had been lost, or it had been destroyed, or it had been purchased by the Mormons and suppressed, a plot motif that's still very popular among certain critics today. Think of the Salt Lake Tribune, which I'm told disappeared from into the First Presidency Vault about 2 weeks ago, and never be seen again. That Spalding's manuscript was said to have contained a secular romance designed merely to entertain and perhaps to make a little money. Was also dismissed as a trifle. Perhaps Sidney Rigdon, the Campbellite scriptorian, had been more than just a conveyor. It scarcely mattered. If it had to be so, it must have been so. Unfortunately for the advocates of the Spalding theory, his manuscript story was recovered from a steamer trunk in Honolulu in 1884. It turned out to be a relatively short yarn, roughly 125 pages, about a group of Romans who set sail for Britain but were driven onto the coast of America by storms at sea. L.L. Rice, the rather surprised owner of the steamer trunk, remarked in the manuscript story in the Book of Mormon that, quote, there is no identity of names, of persons, or places, and there is no similarity of style between them. I should as soon think the Book of Revelation was written by the author of Don Quixote, as that the writer of this manuscript was the author of the Book of Mormon. Faithful adherents of the Spalding theory now claim that his second work, Manuscript Found, was the real source of the Book of Mormon. Fortunately or unfortunately, though, it could not be examined, because nobody knew where it was, nor whether it ever was. Today, Fawn Brodie, though a devout disbeliever in the Book of Mormon and claims of Joseph Smith, effectively sounded the death knell of the Spalding theory in a 1945 biography of the prophet entitled No Man Knows My History. She argued instead that Joseph Smith was the consciously fraudulent author of the book, which reflected his own personality and environment. The dull village idiot was now a myth-maker of prodigious talents. She was, of course, following more or less in the footsteps of Ida Woodbridge Riley, whose 1902 profile of the founder of Mormonism explained the Book of Mormon on the basis of a psychological analysis of Joseph Smith, who was, he said, subject to epileptic fits that somehow were supposed to account for his visions. But Brodie and most everybody else discounted the claim of epilepsy. The trail had also been blazed for her by Harry M. Beardsley's 1931 Joseph Smith and His Mormon Empire, in which Joseph was a paranoiac. In 1948, the Reverend James Black also explained Joseph Smith as mentally ill, a dissociated personality. Thus, as F.W. Kirkham, surveying the scene in the early 1950s, Joseph Smith is first a money digger, then an ignoramus, then a deluded fanatic, then a vile deceiver, a fraud, then an epileptic, a paranoiac, then a myth-maker of prodigious talents. Finally, he is not an ignoramus, he is not a deceiver, rather a person with a dissociated personality. Kirkham predicted that in an age of greater ecumenism, and though he could not have used the phrase of political correctness, the hateful assaults on Joseph Smith that had been so acceptable in the 19th century would virtually disappear from favor among mainstream critics. The growing respectability of Mormonism would lead to a more civil, though no less determined, critique. And the collapse of the Spalding theory would bring explanations full circle, back to Joseph Smith as sole or primary author of the Book of Mormon. The personality of Joseph Smith, he said, his learning, his environment, will be assumed and described by various writers to meet the requirements of his ability to produce the book and to organize the church. Historical facts that must be accepted in the actual writing and printing of the Book of Mormon will be interpreted by the coming writers to meet their various theses explaining the contents of the Book of Mormon. These writers will disagree concerning important assumed facts, but they will all deny the possibility of divine aid in the translation of the ancient record. Kirkham has been proven correct. Of course, some extreme anti-Mormons invoke demonic inspiration to account for it, but among serious writers, the pendulum has clearly swung back to Joseph Smith as the author. In his 1980 Mormon Answer to Skepticism, Why Joseph Smith Wrote the Book of Mormon, republished in 1992 by Signature Books to an overwhelming lack of demand, Robert Hollinger depicts Joseph as, quote, a defender of God, motivated by the noble desire to defend revealed religion against the inroads of deism. Gone is the once obvious fact that the author of the book was a Christianity-mocking atheist. Hollinger explicitly acknowledges that he's turning his back upon the theories of his own mentor, George Arbaugh, whose 1932 Revelation in Mormonism, published by the academically prestigious University of Chicago Press, had confidently divided the text of the Book of Mormon into portions written by either Solomon Spaulding, Sidney Rigdon, or Joseph Smith. John Brooke, in his immensely enjoyable Cambridge University Press book, The Refiner's Fire, presents a Joseph Smith who was a late exemplar of Renaissance Hermeticism and various occultic traditions. Jan Shipps, and at least the early Dan Vogel, emphasized Joseph's supposed fascination with explaining Indian mounts. Robert Anderson's Inside the Mind of Joseph Smith reads the Book of Mormon psychobiographically, claiming to see Joseph working out his own Freudian interior problems in the text. A similar approach is William Moraine's The Sword of Laban, Joseph Smith Jr. and the Dissociated Mind. The famous Yale literary critic Harold Bloom, failing to notice that Joseph Smith was nothing more than a typical blunderhead, calls him a religious genius and places him in the American pantheon alongside Ralph Waldo Emerson and Walt Whitman. On the other hand, an anonymous critic of Joseph Smith, with whom I corresponded over the space of several months, posits an anonymous individual or group of considerable learning, familiar, for example, with rare maps of Inner Arabia, acquainted with Semitic languages, well-read in classical Arabic literature and jurisprudence, who somewhere, sometime, wrote the Book of Mormon for unknown motives, and then for some undiscoverable reason permitted Joseph Smith to publish it as his own. Bill Hamlin and I call this mysterious group the Illuminati, in honor of their remarkable capacity to be everywhere, to do and know everything, while remaining entirely invisible. One faction is still working a way to resurrect the Spaulding theory. The Venerable John L. Smith of Marlow, Oklahoma, continues to labor at a manuscript that will demonstrate Sidney Rigdon to be the real author of the Book of Mormon. I personally can hardly wait. The recent American Apocrypha further illustrates the apparent inability of Book of Mormon critics to agree on much of anything, except that the Book of Mormon is false. Only a few months ago, in fact, one of the editors of American Apocrypha explicitly, huffily, and repeatedly refused to answer a simple question as to whether Joseph Smith believed that he possessed metal plates or knew that he did not, which seems the kind of question that any skeptic's fundamental theory of Book of Mormon origins must answer sooner or later. He would not, he said, lower himself to thinking in such simple-minded categories. His approach is manifest in the book he edited. While the authors all seem to agree broadly that Joseph Smith was the sole or principal author of the Book of Mormon, there are notable disagreements about the how and the why. Edwin Firmage's essay, for example, depicts Joseph Smith as a rather cunning and deliberate fraud, making it all up on the fly, with major plot elements seemingly created on the basis of virtually sudden whims, resulting in serious inconsistencies in the book itself. Susan Staker also offers a Joseph Smith who creates the Book of Mormon rapidly, on the basis of swiftly mutating ideas whose evolution, driven by his own changing circumstances, is apparent within the text itself. George D. Smith partially seems to agree. He uses a highly debatable reading of B.H. Roberts to argue indirectly that Joseph drew upon Ethan Smith's view of the Hebrews in order to compose the Book of Mormon, a method that seems to demand more careful plotting than Firmage and Staker allow. David Wright, in what is by far the most academically rigorous essay in the book, likewise posits a careful and wholly conscious Joseph Smith, but one who in this instance bases at least a substantial part of his Book of Mormon on a close but misguided reading of King James Isaiah. Dan Vogel's second essay presents Joseph as composing an anti-Masonic text, a tract attuned to the controversy that ensued upon the murder of Captain William Morgan in 1826. He is every bit as confident in this assertion as Heber D. Howe was in his earlier explanation, according to which Solomon Spaulding, who died in 1816, was said by Howe, who heard it from Dr. Philastus Hurlbut, who claimed to have heard it from Spaulding's widow nearly 2 decades after Spaulding's death, that Spaulding didn't like Freemasonry. Howe concluded that this explains the Book of Mormon's references to Getty and Roberts and other secret combinations. All of these depictions of the Book of Mormon as a work of fiction directly collide with the testimony of the 3 and 8 witnesses. Accordingly, they must be destroyed. So in his first essay in American Apocrypha, although Dan Vogel grants their honesty, he seeks rather desperately, in my opinion, to explain the witnesses away. Their experiences were merely subjective, internal, hallucinatory. Joseph Smith was a hypnotist. A very fortunate one in the fact that although only a relatively small proportion of the general populace is susceptible to hypnosis, all of his witnesses were easy marks. But perhaps Vogel suggests Joseph also created some tin plates with which to dazzle the yokels. The invocation of this secondary prop may indicate that Vogel himself, to his credit, is not entirely persuaded by his subjective hallucination thesis. But once we've posited a previously unnoticed custom-designed metal foundry under Joseph's management, it also needs to produce the breastplate seen by various witnesses, as well as the brass plates, the Urim Thumb, the Sword of Laban, and the Liahona. One wonders how many skilled metallurgists and craftsmen were available in the area at the time and what the local wage scale was. But then we read Scott Dunn's essay, according to which Joseph Smith created the Book of Mormon by a process of automatic writing. It just flowed out of him. Joseph was dissociative but sincere, and Dunn vigorously denies that conscious fraud was involved. In fact, the dictation process was probably scarcely conscious at all, in any normal sense of the word. If Dunn is right, Firmich and Vogel are wrong. Mutually contradictory accounts are not mutually reinforcing. They're not cumulative. Quite the contrary, they weaken each other. Imagine a murder case in which one witness for the prosecution definitively states that he clearly saw the defendant, Mr. John Jones, who was wearing his characteristic Stetson cowboy hat, empty a 6-shooter into the head of the victim, Miss Roberta Smith, at point-blank range as she stood by the hot dog stand on the beach. A second prosecution witness declares that he saw the defendant, Mrs. Joanna Jones, striding briskly out of the 27th floor restaurant where the murder took place with a fashionable black beret on her head. The prosecution's forensic pathologist, meanwhile, announces his expert verdict that from the marks on Mr. Robert Smith's throat, the victim died of strangulation. With evidence of that character, the prosecution would need bother to seek an indictment, and could never even in its remotest fantasies dream of conviction. Many years ago, Albert Schweitzer published a classic work entitled in English, The Quest for the Historical Jesus, in which he demonstrated, among other things, that the various portraits of Jesus that had been offered up to his time by scholars of Christian origins most commonly said more about their authors than about the historical Jesus. What we see in the various attempts that have been offered thus far to explain the Book of Mormon away might, I think, be labeled The Quest for the Historical Joseph. Early critics, absolutely unwilling to grant that God might have had a hand in the production of the Book of Mormon, sought its author in Joseph Smith, or Sidney Rigdon, or Farley Pratt, or Oliver Cowdery, or anywhere else that could serve as a refuge against the book's own claims. How often have I said to you, remarked Holmes to Watson, that when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. The Book of Mormon's claims for itself were, to many minds, simply unendurable, and so other theories have necessarily prospered. It is so still today. Only now, the most serious criticisms of the Book of Mormon tend to come not from self-proclaimed Orthodox Christians, but from self-identified atheistic materialists. The historian Dale Morgan, much admired in certain contemporary circles, wrote a 1945 letter to the believing Latter-day Saint historian Juanita Brooks. He states the fundamental issue with unusual frankness and candor. With my point of view on God, I am incapable of accepting the claims of Joseph Smith and the Mormons, be they however so convincing. If God does not exist, how can Joseph Smith's story have any possible validity? I will look everywhere for explanations, except through the one explanation that is the position of the Church. Regarding the Book of Mormon, the editors of American Apocrypha acknowledged, quote, the book's interesting and impressive literary, theological, psychological, and spiritual qualities that have had such a profound impact on people. It's refreshing to find some critics now acknowledging the Book of Mormon's once universally denied merits. Nonetheless, they deny the factual truth of its narrative. Is the Book of Mormon pseudonymous? We think so. Apocryphal? Yes. Is it therefore less able to touch people's hearts? No. Our position is that the scriptural tradition includes fiction, parables, poetry, hyperbole, psalms, historical verisimilitude, and other genres, and that such writing can be as powerful in providing people with spiritual guidance as non-fiction. To acknowledge the obvious fictional quality of the Book of Mormon is not to detract from the beauty and brilliance of the sermons, visions, and other imagery. One is tempted, though, to ask how much spiritual guidance the editors themselves actually find in the book. One of them is expressly declared as atheism, the other, just Thursday night, explicitly denied the existence of any spiritual realities and proclaimed himself a thoroughgoing materialist. After all, it seems that much, if not all, of the book's supposed spiritual power is available only to those who believe its claims about itself and act on those claims. And on the point of view offered up by American Apocrypha, those who do so are quite literally fools. In closing, the muse descended on a local poet not long ago, inspiring him to pen new lyrics to the tune of the popular primary song, "The Golden Plates Lay Hidden." The resulting poem serves nicely, I think, to summarize the position at least assumed by the editors and authors of American Apocrypha, when they're not speculating about the manufacture of tin plates to bedazzle the local peasants. Here's how it goes. No golden plates existed outside of Joseph's mind, and 11 other lunatics in whom he could confide. The record made by Joseph, a 19th century fraud, still makes for pious reading. Let's pretend it came from God.
Thank you. Questions for Dan?
Would you repeat your...
Repeat the talk?
Yeah. You ended too early. Look at that.
I actually want him to sing the song. Do you have any specific questions? Oh, yes.
The arguments that are the arguments that are postulated by the atheistic materialists of many of the authors of American Apocrypha brings to mind to me some Western Islamicists when they come to approach the Quran. Do you see similarities between the two groups?
Absolutely. In fact, as I was writing this, I thought it would just all sort of fall together very neatly. The more I began to throw into it, the more I began to see the makings of potentially even a book. And what I was thinking about was possibly a kind of parallel track analysis of reactions to the Quran and to the Book of Mormon. And there's certain fashions. For example, the accusation that Joseph Smith was an epileptic, and that somehow epilepsy would, in some mysterious manner that eludes me altogether, account for the Book of Mormon and the rise of the church, is paralleled by absolutely identical claims made about Muhammad, that he was an epileptic, and that accounts for his visions in the Book of Quran. So I think it would be a really interesting exercise to compare them. And my bet is that these explanations, these reductionistic explanations, proceed sort of parallel at the same time, or if anything, there's probably a little time lag as the critics of the Book of Mormon learn what's being said about Muhammad. I think they're probably related. I suspect they were even reading the same stuff. At least the people writing on Mormonism were reading the ones writing on Muhammad. It was very fashionable to compare Joseph Smith and Muhammad for a long time.
One last question. I'm kind of putting you on the spot. Do you think that it is easier to explain the Quran from a naturalistic standpoint than the Book of Mormon?
Yeah. I do. I don't do that myself, but you have a difference between the Quran and the Book of Mormon. The Quran is a revelation through Muhammad that really could be seen as being purely internal and subjective. That is, no one heard the voices with him. No one saw any object that the Quran came from. So in that sense, you don't have the problem that's posed by the witnesses, or a very real problem in the case of Mormonism. There is a set of plates. Now, Dan Vogel waves them aside with an argument. I'll be perfectly frank with you. I found his argument absurd. But anyway, and a little bit desperate, more than a little bit desperate, because that is the fundamental obstacle. This whole idea that Joseph's just making it up. That there's an object there, variously estimated at about 60 pounds. A lot of people see it. There are other objects, not just the plates, but other things. Now, if you're going to say that it's all fiction, then it can't just be some little happy myth that's created in Joseph's mind. Somebody has to have gone to the trouble of hammering out plates, inscribing them with phony inscriptions, creating breastplate, creating the liahona, creating all this paraphernalia to dazzle the yokels with. Muhammad didn't do that, and that puts him, it changes the situation quite a bit. It's easier to assume that Muhammad was mistaken but sincere than to assume that of Joseph Smith. If you say he's mistaken and sincere, then who created all the stuff? So in one sense, you can see that as an avenue for attacking his sincerity. On the other hand, it's an avenue for affirming that something really was happening there that has objective external existence, as opposed to Muhammad's case.
Thank you very much.
I know traditionally we've taken a break, but the next section is very short. So if we could ask the speakers who have spoken to come down, we could ask everyone who's spoken at the conference, please come down. You too, John, come on. What we're going to do is, this will be very short, maybe 15 minutes the most, but if you would like to direct a question to any of the speakers, you've been thinking about things, dying to ask something. Some of you may come down, may not get anything asked of you, but don't feel too bad. But let me pull this out so we can pass the microphone as we need it. In fact, why don't you come over to this side here? Why don't you? John, you can sit right here. That's your seat. That's fine. Roger and Dan, over here. Over. Somebody check it, boss you around. Okay. Questions? Yes. And tell me who it's going to be directed to, or I just pass it down to who wants to.
Danny Anderson, and a question for Brother Skousen. Just what was your greatest aha or impression, or if you had to pick one thing that was your biggest surprise, what was it when you did all your work?
Well, it was probably finding the systematic nature of the text. Probably along with that also, the witnesses had said certain things were taking place in the manuscript. The original manuscript was consistent with that. Joseph Smith seeing actual words, being able to spell out things. The language could not have been his own. It had Hebraisms in them that were non-English, and they've all been proved from the text because of non-English. But the sort of miraculous nature of it all is probably the biggest surprise. I didn't expect it. I was just going to do a critical text of the Book of Mormon. I had no intent on proving it, no apologetic motive whatsoever. I just wanted to do a critical text. So the evidence was there. That was the biggest surprise.
Kevin, since Mike was unable to answer, I thought I'd restate my question earlier on the New Mormon Challenge to see if I can get some ideas. So just to restate it, as far as first, what are your impressions of it, and second and third, what do you think that it will do for both anti-Mormonism and Mormon apologetics?
Well, not having read it, like I said, I have to base my opinions on secondhand reports. And I think that the New Mormon Challenge, like any other book or website or anything that challenges LDS thought, is going to help us move forward. Anything that calls into question things that we have accepted or traditions that we have helps strengthen our resolve to find answers and come up with better answers ourselves.
I've read 3 of the chapters, so I'm kind of part of it. I find that though the people who have written the various articles in this book are much more qualified than our general run-of-the-mill anti-Mormon ministry types, yet they still have the same misconceptions about our church, its beliefs, and about our scriptures. Some of them, frankly, have never really looked at us in the past, and it seems to me that the only information they have came from the editors. The editors sent them a stack of things and said, here's what the Mormons are saying on this topic. Would you please write an article on it? And so the guy writes an article and is unaware that half the things he's saying have already been addressed in print. He's never seen what's already been put out there. So they don't make very good arguments, unfortunately. I do find, however, that the tone of most of the ones I've seen, at least, seems to be a kinder, gentler tone than you will find in the Ed Deckers of the world. And that's refreshing. Although it's easier to deal with the Ed Deckers because nobody pays attention to them.
First, 2 questions. One to Dan Peterson and one to Renee. I wanted to find out recently I wanted to find out how a Islamic convert would react to the Book of Mormon and to specifically missionary discussions. And I also got a CD from Fuller Theological Seminary after 9/11 because I wanted to find out more about Islam. And I found out that the religions seem to be very similar in some of their theology. And I wondered, for Dan, I wondered if you knew or could figure out how Muhammad got some of his ideas, because they seem similar to Mormonism. And secondly, to Renee, I wanted to find out how did you react to when the Book of Mormon talked about preferring white skin and that kind of thing?
The question is, how would a Muslim convert react to the discussions to the Book of Mormon? Well, of course, it would vary. There are all sorts of Muslim converts coming from all sorts of backgrounds and all different varying degrees of commitment to Islam or understanding of Islam. We have a fair number of Muslim converts who now join the church, and I remember one in particular who picked up a copy of the Arabic translation of the Book of Mormon and began to read it aloud, and soon slipped into chanting in the style of the Quran, which absolutely amazed me. He liked it, in other words. And so some find there are a lot of similarities between Islam and Mormonism, and there are some, but I would tend to think that most of the similarities, at least as Islam has developed, are fairly superficial. How did Muhammad get so many things right? Well, I haven't come to a really firm decision on what I think about Muhammad. I'm willing to go at least this far. I think that he was inspired. I think if we can say in the first presence he has on numerous occasions that Martin Luther was inspired, that Plato was inspired, that Aristotle was inspired, certainly Muhammad can be considered inspired too. Now, whether we can go any further than that, I don't really know. I haven't made my mind up firmly on that, but I'm willing to believe that Muhammad had genuine spiritual experiences. Some of the accounts of his early experiences particularly strike me as entirely plausible. There are parallels outside of the Bible, but also in the Bible, some of the things he claims. And so that wouldn't trouble me a bit to believe that Muhammad in particular and Islam in general can be a transmitter of divine truth, as so many other religions can be as well.
I'm not sure, but I think the question was, how did I feel when I found out that white skin is preferable to black skin? Stacy? Where it says it will become white and delightsome, and then it was changed to pure and delightsome.
Yes, that's what I was referring to.
I had a feeling that's what you were referring to. Well, white has always been seen as a color of purity, and blackness has always been used to represent sin or darkness. And when I was an anti, I definitely saw it that way and taught that the Mormon church taught it that way. But then after I had a change of heart, after joining the church, I realized that white and delightsome, pure delightsome, it's the heart, it's not the skin color. That the skin color has nothing to do with white, black, whatever. It's a matter of the heart. And my heart is just as white and delightsome as any white person. But I wasn't
Hi, Mike Parker. A question for Sister Danes. The Salt Lake Tribune, Utah's independent voice since 1873, has an article on yesterday's session, and the headline is "Mormon Apologists Paint a Pretty Picture of Polygamy." I was wondering if you'd like to respond at least to the headline or to the article if you've read it, and perhaps if you could summarize again from yesterday, what would you say would be the overriding feeling of women who were involved in plural marriage? I know that there's a wide variety of experience that some really loved it and others really despised it, but what would you say would be the predominant, or in what percentages would you find feeling?
This was all my question too, so why don't you go sit down now?
Answer the last part of that first to say I don't think anybody knows percentages of how people felt about plural marriage. I am now doing a more investigative study of individuals. That's not what I was doing in the study that is in my current book. It's not what I was doing yesterday. And it's not just percentage of women. As somebody who's married, I can tell you my views of marriage have kind of, well, I've been happily married. They've changed over time. And that's what happened with those in plural marriage as well. Things could be going very well. Wife would come into the family, and she just didn't seem to fit. That created problems within the family. So I don't think that anybody's ever going to come up with percentages. I just don't think we have the ability to do that. We don't have the primary sources that we need to do that. What do I think about the headline? It's interesting that I gave a very shortened presentation. What I gave yesterday at the Mormon History Association, and people from Sunstone came up and asked me if I would give that presentation at Sunstone, and I was already committed here. I would give them the same presentation at Sunstone. So my attempt was to understand the plural marriage. When I first started studying plural marriage, it was not it was not to say it was happy, it was not to say it was sad, it was to understand. And that's what I was trying to do, is trying to understand what was going on. What was the other part of your question? I've forgotten now.
That was it.
Okay, thank you.
The Tribune article.
There was a problem with the tone. I don't think it represented what I was saying, and there were also some factual errors in there. That's one of the problems. Anytime somebody starts taking statistics from someone getting up and talking about them, every time the person has done that, they've gotten the statistics wrong. When you work with statistics, you do it very, very carefully. You lay it out very carefully. And anybody who wants to do that really ought to go and look at the care. I've done that in the book. I think it's very difficult to take those statistics out of the talk, partly because even though I'm very careful, there is something in the hearing process, I think it's internalized, that it's very difficult to get it precisely as the study is done. And so I've already talked to the reporter and told her there were some real problems with the article. And so.
What I'm dreading is tomorrow's headline might say 105,000 errors.
We just noticed, though, that they came out with a later edition of the paper and said, "Pretty Mormon apologist paints pictures of the question I had is, we see in kind of in the apologetics arena now, a lot of the big questions that we used to argue about seem to be getting factual support from the LDS point of view, from history or whatever. What do you, and I don't care who particularly responds to this, what do you see as the big things yet to be answered that we don't really have good answers for yet?
I still don't think we know where the Book of Mormon took place. I think the external is still a lot of work to be done. And some people say it isn't important, but if we actually found some place with, Bet Levi or something like that, we'd be pretty excited if we found some really good evidence. The internal evidence and the witnesses, I think, are very compelling and very strong, but we're still looking for the plays. I think that's my view.
That's got to have a
The trouble is I have about 50 contradictory opinions on well, I think there are a lot of areas that still need to be looked at. There's still questions about the, well, one of the issues that comes up in American Apocrypha is that if you look at the Book of Mormon in the translation order, that is starting with, say, Mosiah, beginning Mosiah and work on through, then starting again with First Nephi on up to Mosiah, you have a distinct theological evolution there showing Joseph Smith's changing concept of things. And you can trace it in the book. I find that really dubious, and the two arguments I've seen for it in American Apocrypha don't strike me as very impressive. But I think maybe it's time to start reading the Book of Mormon that way and see, can we detect historical evolution of ideas within the Book of Mormon? Does it fit the history of the Nephites? Or, how can we see any evidence of change, or was this a society that's sort of frozen in time for the whole 1,000-year history of it? Of course, it's complicated by the fact that you have largely an abridgment of records, so that some of the earlier writings might have been brought up to date by Mormon's editing. We just don't know. There are issues like that. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done. One of the areas we're looking at is to do work on the temple. Well, I'll just say that we have some projects in the works, I think, that would be very, very interesting to people on temple-related issues. It's not that we have a problem that really needs to be solved, as so much as that there's a lot of rich material out there that remains to be mined. And so we want to get to work on that. So, and one area that hasn't been looked at very much so far has been the Book of Moses. We need to look at that a little bit more. I don't know, there are lots of things. I mean, there are scores of avenues that I want to see us go.
On that same vein, Brant, pay attention.
Yes.
Is there anyone else even remotely doing the types of things that you were doing? And then for Roger, with your work on with what's coming out on theosis and deification, where is this leaving other religions? Because to me, it's getting to the point where this is just undeniably an early Christian doctrine. So where is this going to place them with LDS scholars coming in and putting it in front of everyone's face?
Well, for my point, John Sorenson's the godfather of everything that I'm doing, because I build on the foundation of his geographic correlation. If it weren't there, I couldn't do it. Unfortunately, I don't see a lot of other people taking the same path. There's a lot of that that's starting to happen out of farms. But my experience with a lot of people in farms is they're still old world oriented rather than new world oriented. So I don't see a lot of it yet, but then I don't see a lot of me out there yet either in print. So, we may have somebody else hiding out there, they just don't come to this conference.
It's interesting that there is just a lot of material that has surfaced in the last 50 years, documents that it's absolutely amazing that we have. I think we only have, for example, the text of 2nd Enoch in the Slavonic, and yet it's seen to be a first century Jewish document. It's a miracle that that particular document survived. And yet it contains the most extensive account of theosis, really, in all Judeo-Christian literature. What I find is that there's a lot of information out there, but most scholars are quite frankly not interested in pursuing the information. They've got other things that they're much, much more worried about. What's tended in the past is that Old Testament scholars, for example, will recognize that there's a council of the gods and that God was an embodied person. But then most people are interested in getting past the New Testament, and they'd rather talk about Christianity in terms of what classical Christianity is. And so it's just an interesting aberration. Different types of Judaism appeared, of which Christianity is just one variety. As of the last little while, though, very interestingly, a tremendous amount of interest has been placed on Pharisaic Judaism, which is understood to be the foundation of Christianity. In other words, Christ, I think a good argument could be made, was a reformer of Pharisaism, not an enemy of Pharisaism. And so as people try to understand a little bit more carefully what early Pharisaic Judaism represented and a Christian variation on that, we'll get a lot more information. When I do find scholars who will write about things like theosis or the embodiment of God or the council of the gods, they're very thoroughly convinced this is the case. And the extant evidence just seems to be that that's simply the way it is. We've got brute facts coming out that essentially have been proved, and there's really no question that this is the way that they believe. And as to how this leaves some of our evangelical friends, I advocate that you should hug your evangelical friends because they need it.
Just a couple of points. Regarding theosis, the one question, of course, is can we become as gods? And there's plenty of evidence for that in the scriptures as well as early Christian texts. But what fascinates me is the question, was God once man, as Joseph Smith said? And in fact, I have found 2 early Jewish texts and 2 early Christian texts that say that God was a man. And he became God. How? How did he become God? He ate the fruit. He ate the fruit. You've heard that before, right? I just want to mention also, and maybe Dan was going to do this, I don't know, that at Farms we've got several books underway. Dan is one of the editors of 2 of them, and I'll let him mention those 2, and I'll mention the other 2 that I'm working on. One that's nearly completed, I just have to polish off a few things on it, is called Joseph Smith and the Ancient World. And it goes into great detail on a lot of aspects, including the Book of Moses. I do more on the Book of Moses in that volume than on anything else. So if the Book of Moses hadn't been hit a lot in the past, it will be now. And the companion volume to that is the Book of Mormon, the Ancient World, which is half done. And Brian Howgood and I are also working on another one that's very similar to these 2 that we call Ancient Texts in Support of the Book of Abraham. You should be seeing those appear in the next year and a half, I'd say.
Well, I wasn't going to mention the other 2 books, but I will. Yeah, it's advertisement time. They're not out yet, but we're working on one book that the working title has always been Joseph Smith's Greatest Hits. That won't be the printed title, but that should be out, we hope, in a few months. Under some title or other. That's a kind of take on some things that we find especially compelling about Joseph Smith's scriptural production. And then we're also working on a Festschrift, an honorary volume in honor of Truman Madsen, which has a number of essays from various people, including a lot from non-LDS, Jewish and other Christian authors. The one I was going to mention, though, since the question of theosis came up, I think Roger's working in a really extremely important vein, which is to look at the doctrine of human deification before the Hellenistic influence, that is, largely before the Fathers, and before the patristic literature. That's really crucial because a lot of people have argued that deification is really a Greek notion, a pagan notion that comes in from the pure Judeo-Christian stream that originally taught, as all good Hebrews knew, an ontological distinction between God and man, as if Hebrews ever thought of such things. But there is a book that's going to be coming out in the next couple of weeks, I hope, from Farms. It's a master's thesis that was done by Dominican priests studying at the Graduate Theological Union, the Dominican School of Theology, Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. And it's an examination of the Latter-day Saint doctrine of exaltation, comparing it with the Eastern Christian notion of theosis and deification. And he basically says, look, it's just astonishing this doctrine, which existed in Eastern Christendom, early Christianity, reappeared on North American soil. And he says, He actually takes specific aim at the movie The Godmakers and says, these guys say the Latter-day Saints have a problem. It's not the Mormons who have a problem, it's these people who have a problem, because this is an authentic Christian doctrine, and they don't have it, but the Mormons do. It's nice to hear anyone say that, but it's especially nice hearing it come from a Dominican priest who has no dog in this fight. Anyway, so that's something maybe to look forward to.
These are the last two questions.
This question is for Brother DeWitt. This regarding the evolution of, Christian scholarship over the years regarding biblical inerrancy, and you mentioned the evangelical scholarship now, some changing their views. Where do you see that leading, and is that going to trickle down to the clergy and then to the laity, because we know that they stand pretty firm?
I think that it will be restricted to those who have solid doctoral degrees from accredited universities rather than from diploma mills. The people who are evangelicals and who give papers at the Evangelical Theological Society meetings every year, which are held just the week before the Society of Biblical Literature meetings in whatever city it's going to be at that given time. I think they're the only ones who are going to really be looking at that in this way. I do not think it will trickle down. I do not think that we can expect that suddenly the Southern Baptist Convention, which is way, way over on the other end of the spectrum from these men, would ever say, well, we accept that there could be Bible mistakes over the years as the Bible has been transmitted down through time and translated over and over. And so I don't think that'll ever happen. And the last ones who would ever say that, of course, are the anti-Mormon ministries. I mean, these guys are making their living off of us, right? They're making a living off of attacking us and saying, well, look, guys, send in your love donations, and we're going to do something to help all them Mormons out of their troubles. Some of them they may convince. I hope that most people have a little bit more sense than that to fall for that.
Dan, does that come out in the occasional papers?
Yes. Which one?
The one you just talked about?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
This question is for Roger. After having read much of your writing on ZLNB last year, I was quite fascinated, especially with your interaction with Rory McKenzie, who is just whom I consider to be a rather brilliant Catholic apologist. Much of what I read of his position mystifies me from the LDS position, because in my opinion, his arguments absorb a great many of the traditional LDS claims to uniqueness and authenticity and that kind of thing. And so my question is really actually more focused than that, but that's kind of the broad approach where I'm coming from. Specifically, based upon what you gave your talk on, what would you consider the defining, the distinctiveness of LDS theosis over that of Eastern or Western Catholic theosis? I know you talked a lot about the physical attributes of deity. Aside from that, what would be the top, say, 2 or 3 distinctives of LDS theosis that puts us, what you would say, maybe a cut above?
Maybe speaking just simply from a philosophical viewpoint, Truman Madison wrote a book that changed my life many years ago. He called it The Highest Inness. And in this, he has a conversation with he recreates a conversation that he had. He was defending his faith in front of 3 gentlemen who had degrees in theology. And they confronted him, and they said that the belief that we could become like God was rank heresy. And he said that it hurt a lot, but then he proceeded to give an account of how he felt about the nature of Christ. And he said he had a chance to improve the argument over the years, but nevertheless, this is the way that he gave it. He asked whether Christ was human, and they admitted that he was, and asked if he was a certain height, and they said that he was. And finally, he asked the question, why would it be bad for God? Why can't God make us co-creators with him? And of course, from a Greek metaphysical viewpoint, God is the single ground of existence, and there cannot be any other. And they explained that to him, and he turned around and he says, that's interesting. You say that God cannot have peers, he cannot have equals, he cannot have co-creators. And he says, but our religion demands that God have peers, and that demands that God have co-creators. And he asked the question, and I remember the electricity that went through me when I read this. Which of these two gods is more worthy of our worship? In other words, what tends to happen is Mormonism has a good explanation for mortality. The reason we come down to this earth is because we're here to learn and we're here to be tested. And we go through a lot of evil and suffering. But you can only justify evil and suffering if there's a greater good that's going to happen. If the greater good is that we are going to become like God, then all the evil and suffering that happens to us, the learning and the testing that takes place, is worth it. For our classical Christian friends who believe that we are forever going to be mere creatures and never able to attain the ontological level of God, there is no possible explanation for mortality other than God created creatures to worship him. But LDS theology and its striking theosis, in which we literally become like God, then offers the most plausible explanation for mortality. That, I think, is at least the biggest advantage we have because of our theosis.
I think we ought to thank our speakers again. I think I'll have this wound up in about 2 minutes. So if we just wait for about 2 minutes, let me do the final things. First of all, make sure that you have signed up for